Hey everyone, welcome to the astrology forecast for the month of February 2026. I'm here with my friend Aerin Fogel. We've talked for a bit about doing these monthly astrology forecasts. Kind of took us a while to come together to do it, but we have just in time for really an incredibly dramatic month, one of the most dramatic months of astrology that we've had in a long time. So thank you for being here with me for this, Aaron.
My pleasure. Nice to talk it out with someone.
And for people that are unfamiliar with you, in case there are people, is there just anything at the outset you'd like to say about your work and practice and how people can find you and connect with you?
Sure. Yeah, I am a Toronto-based astrologer. I've been practicing professionally for almost 15 years, but studying for a long time, like most of us. And I do astrology as well as channeled core pattern readings that look at people's repetitive life patterns. And I play music. But we're here to talk about astrology, and I love talking to Gray about astrology. I feel like we have similar mixtures of approaches where we both work
Hmm.
with a lot of mythic, modern, psychological, but also integrating a lot of traditional techniques. So
Hmm.
I feel like we've got a similar approach, kind of.
Yeah, definitely. And so the month of February is just incredibly dramatic. It's the kind of month probably people watching this know what we're already talking about. It's really something that for many, many years, myself and other astrologers have wondered like what's going to be happening in February 2026 because so many things are all coming together. First and foremost is the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune in the first degree of Aries. As you and I are recording this right now, we have Neptune at the very, very, very end of Pisces right now. But by the time the month of February begins, Neptune will be in Aries. In the middle of the month, around February 13th or maybe 14th, depending upon your time zone, Saturn comes into Aries. We then get a solar eclipse in Aquarius in the sign of Saturn, and then we get the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. There's more than that happening this month, but that's really one of the main reasons why this month has just stood out for so long, also in the context of all the other things happening this year. But yeah, have what is that something that you've been wondering about for a while? And I mean, one of the things that I feel about it, just wondering what would be happening. We have to say that current events are not disappointing. I mean, things are dramatically changing. All these long-standing orders and ordering principles and alliances are either breaking up or on the threshold of change. And there's great uncertainty and so many unknowns going on right now about what's actually even happening, which is kind of to be expected with this, right?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, regardless of what's going on in people's personal lives, we can all look around us and see there's like a great stirring that's taking
Mhm.
place. And I do feel that to some extent that's happening for people individually as well as it is collectively. But it is a big deal. I mean, the slow-moving planets come together so sparingly because their orbits are so long. So I think that's why, even for people who don't know a lot of astrology or who are just dipping their toe in, like it's something that they've heard about or something they've been thinking about because it's such a rare event and it happens so occasionally. So it is really something to pay attention to.
Yeah, so Saturn, Neptune, it's about every 36 years or so that they come together and form conjunctions. And very, very consistently, you just see collective notions of reality really warping and changing, either through technological innovations, sometimes like there was one in 1882, which is around the time Thomas Edison like lit up a city block with electricity, and that's often said to be like the dawning of the electrical age. And we just think about having electric street lights and lights like that being able to light up the night and forever changing our relationship with darkness and different, rhythms of our just day to day, how that impacts our creativity, even the way we think about things and dream. It's just huge. And there's often also big revolutions, rebellions, things like the Russian Revolution, things like great previous orders and divisions and alliances either dissolving or being torn down, like the Berlin Wall coming down, like the Soviet Union dissolving the last time they came together. And so it's always really, really dramatic. And another thing about them that I've found just researching is that they do happen in sequences of the quadruplicities, in terms of like there'll be a grouping of like two or three in a row in like a cardinal sign, and then in mutable signs, and then in fixed signs. So since the 1953 one, that one was in Libra, we've been having these cardinal sequence ones. We had another one in 89 in Capricorn, and this one is in Aries. I've sort of theorized that there seems something, looking at these historical patterns, that with the cardinal signs, like something even more extreme gets initiated with like a general trend of a new type of era. Like in the past, like the Renaissance and like the Enlightenment, generally speaking, are sort of emerging in those time periods. So just thinking also about the nature of cardinal signs, these tend to be faster moving. Something's really coming in. This one's in Aries, which makes it even more extreme in that kind of way. And then it's also in the first degree of the zodiac on this Aries point, which makes it even more extreme. It's really the fact that it is at that Aries point, that it's just been so incredible to wonder what would actually happen. And it really does feel like we're there. I mean, something really is dramatically changing. So for those of you listening, if you're born, especially those of you born during a Saturn Neptune alignment, like in 1953 or around or in 1989, this is likely to be a very important time for you with major turning points in your life story. Definitely could also be the case if you're born with like a Saturn Neptune opposition or a square. But Aerin, I know you were born at the last Saturn Neptune conjunction in Capricorn, and your group of people also has Uranus there. Yeah, I was just curious what you've been feeling with yourself and just people also that are born around that time. What's been your sense of how everyone's doing at this time coming into this month?
Yeah, everyone's doing their best. But it's an interesting time to be approaching this Saturn-Neptune conjunction because as an astrologer, I've spent so much time thinking about what I consider to be like a mini generation of people within the millennial group that have specifically that Saturn-Uranus-Neptune conjunction. Um, and I feel in a way like it's a group of people that were born into the first moment in the world when we were starting to realize that we were running out of resources.
Mm.
Like there was this initial understanding in the late 80s that we were burning through resources that were not being generated from the earth as quickly as we were going through them, or there was this kind of initial understanding of climate change. And of course, that conjunction was in Capricorn. So I think it had a lot to do with our relationship to the earth, but in that cardinal way, like the speed of culture not matching the speed at which the earth is able to support us in the way that we're using it. So there is a feeling, I think to some extent for like all people of younger generations, there's a feeling of being born into a world that we don't know what it's going to be as we get into the latter years of our life. Are we going to have topsoil? Are we going to have icebergs? What are the fault lines going to look like? These are questions that we were sort of raised with, and the
Hmm.
understanding that like some kind of crumbling was coming geologically, but also not raised with the reality to really do much about it or to even know what that would look like. We have a lot of questions with not a lot of answers. So I think one of the challenges of this particular synodic cycle is the understanding of something without really knowing exactly what to do about it. There's like the
Mm,
Neptune piece of being able to see this massive context of something that spans generations. And if you're born in that late 80s conjunction, it's like you're born into a world that was already like this when you were born. It's not much
hmm.
that you did about it or can do about it. But then the Saturn piece of like, well, how do I live my life? Or what am I to do with this world that I've been born into?
Totally. Yeah, and that's definitely a part of sort of the existential crisis of Saturn, Neptune about just like what is reality, but also in the way that Neptune can really take us into this interconnected field of bringing people together along certain beliefs or ideals and combining with Saturn, there's definitely like that sort of apocalyptic, almost dark cast to the imagination and fears about potential lack and scarcity. And there's other good things about Saturn, but there is that side of Saturn that can be really extreme when combined with Neptune. So yeah, that fear of being out of resources is stuff that makes a lot of sense, that that's the first thing that really came to mind to you to talk about with that group of people growing up that way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like being born into disillusionment. And I think
Yeah.
that's
Mm-hmm.
something that many people in the world are struggling with, but like
Mm-hmm.
specifically people of that mini generation, the Saturn,
Mm-hmm.
Uranus, Neptune, it's a disillusionment of like, what can I even do about this? Or that sort
Right.
of hopelessness of being confronted with the harsh reality of Saturn. And then the desire to sort of Neptune dissociate around it. I think that's really been a challenge for a lot of
Yeah, absolutely. What can you even do about it? You know, when I was born in the mid 70s, that was definitely something that was in my field of awareness growing up. And obviously, you know, I was like 14 years old at the last in the time period that you're talking about. So as a preteen teenager, that type of same time period that you're talking about with all of that was obviously in my awareness at that time. Also, people my age being impacted in that way. But yeah, there's really something about being born into that moment. When I think about mid 70s generation like me, like we very much grew up under this fear of nuclear Armageddon, where that the Cold War was really at a extreme, and that fear of nuclear potential nuclear bombs, you know, and annihilation was very present collectively in that kind of apocalyptic way. And so interestingly, the 89 conjunction with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and there were some different attempts at treaties and different things where it's not like it's ever gone away, but did something about that conjunction seem to take that off the as much of an extreme type of a fear being so present as it had been. Yeah, interestingly, as we're coming into this one, it's definitely something that's back up
people.
under potential topics for sure. Well, also with 89, obviously there's the World Wide Web being the concept coming out then and the internet coming in not long after that. So this whole cycle's been so much about the World Wide Web and the internet and how that's also been reshaping everything. When we go back to the 53 one, that was very much when the television era was taking over in that kind of way of screens connecting all of us, which also went very much in with like potential propaganda and manipulation. And something else, 53 gets associated a lot with the Cold War in the United States, like the Red Scare and sort of like an inquisition based upon insinuating whether or not you are a communist or not, or just being suspected of one. This idea of inquisitions and witch hunts, including like literal witch hunts, as well as the idea of a witch hunt as a metaphor for any kind of inquisition, which is, again, themes we're seeing right now. This is also very consistent with this Saturn Neptune combination. I think it has something to do with the ideals, the potential. It's a combination where potentially we could have this whole rebirth of ideals, or like structuring this idealistic dream or vision that you want to bring into reality. But at the same time, sometimes when it happens, people want to, insist upon their ideals or their belief system, and persecuting people that are not aligned with that, or being perceived as a threat one way or another. And so, and that idea of like enforcing your ideals upon somebody else is definitely something else we see a lot with this combination. That 53 though one was also in the United States. For example, the civil rights era was really coming in a lot stronger at that time period. Desegregation cases in the Supreme Court coming out of that time period. In that time period, like Malcolm X was in prison. He came out, he like became Malcolm X, and that his whole journey really was born with that Saturn Neptune conjunction. So there's always all these, yeah, different activism, people really wanting to overturn orders, and all this always coming up when these things come together.
Mhm. Yeah, which makes a lot of sense, like that 1953 conjunction being in Libra. So it was very much about
Hmm.
a social process that was taking place, and community, and even what you were describing of like which side are you on, or which belief are you holding, like those kind of air themes that were happening. And then the one in the late 80s being much more about borders and walls and the earth and our
Hmm.
resources and those kind of Capricorn themes. So it will be interesting to get now this third cardinal one, which, like you said, is about as cardinal as it gets, being the first degree of the zodiac. Like there's a real initiatory quality to that, because all cardinal signs want to begin something, but starting at the very beginning of the zodiac, in a way, it's like we still don't know exactly what that will be. But I suspect that because it's an Aries conjunction, it's about identity, or it's about the self in some way, like that emphasis on individual existence, or, who has the right to exist, or, what kind of existence is part of the social fabric that we're building.
Mm. And definitely, I've seen really consistently with Neptune and Aries, especially, right, creating a like really kind of, on one hand, we like pushing through and insisting on this new order or reordering, and the old order being overturned. And that can look really disruptive and really scary. And that, I know that's definitely in the atmosphere right now with the way things are breaking up and changing. But I will say I've seen with Neptune and Aries, not always, but sometimes, and pretty often, there's a lot of examples of reforms and reformations actually ending up emerging out of this, even though it's really obviously difficult and chaotic and extremely volatile when people are living through those time periods. But yeah, with Aries, there's this much more like fiery, fast, kind of taking down what was there before. I think it's obviously a sign of Mars. It's a home of Mars, so we have that real force of Mars. It's also the exaltation of the sun. So I think solar figures. I mean, we are seeing a rise of authoritarianism, or people taking on that attitude and stance. But I think there's also something about people's personal sovereignty that we can also bring in with that. And that's definitely at play with, I think, Pluto being in Aquarius at the same time. And as we're going to talk about, this month of February is like extreme Aquarius activation, which is obviously the opposite sign from the sun, where the is like the home of the sun. So I definitely think there's real hope, I think, for, even though it might seem scary what's going on, all the big change, and it's going to likely get way more extreme with this. If we can keep in mind where we want things to go and what we do want to create with our lives and our communities, I mean, incredible change can come through and happen at the same time this is all going on.
Yeah, I feel very strongly about that. And I feel strongly about like the word initiation for this
Hmm.
conjunction that we're entering because the nature of an initiation is to put us through some kind of death-like process,
Hmm.
um, some old form dying off in order to rebirth something new, which is the purpose of Aries, right? It's a birth process. And that's another way we can think about it. Like what you were saying, it's scary and intense. It's a sign ruled by Mars. It's the birth canal. And there is a kind of danger to the birth process. Like things go wrong in a birth, it's fast, it's intense, there's blood, there's like chaos, but it's necessary for life to occur. So I think about it as some kind of necessary initiatory process that we're in where it is messy, but there's no life that can begin on the other side of that without our capacity to go through that birth canal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the even though we were talking about those other conjunctions, the order changing, it is also interesting that the Libra one was the exaltation of Saturn. And then the
Mm.
last one you said it had even more, the emphasis on borders and walls being warped was the home of Saturn. And this is the fall of Saturn. It does feel like it's going to be even more fat, like even more breaking out of where things have been and really setting things into motion. So what I'll do is just start by let's look at some of the big overview of February. So the month of February really starts out extremely loudly. It's hard to imagine a month starting out more dramatically and then just keeping up the pace really the whole time and sort of like as loud as February opens it keeps going with more and more happening as we move through the months. So we have a full moon in Leo on the very first day of the month, which is essentially happening at the same time that Uranus is stationing direct at 27.5 degrees of Taurus on February 3rd, which is notable because it's the final time for many, many decades that Uranus will be stationing direct in Taurus. So at this point, Uranus is going to be moving forward to go into Gemini towards the end of Aries. It's not going to come back to Taurus. It also means so our final stories and big messages relating to this transit of Uranus and Taurus, which goes all the way back to like 2018, is going to get activated here. Uranus is always really intensified when stationing, and there tends to be big sudden events and revelations and all this whole upsurge of Uranian things. And this full moon is applying to a square with Uranus. So it's for the stationing is being additionally activated by a full moon. And then, as we'll talk about really in this first week or so of the month, it's further activated by Mercury coming through and forming a square, and then Venus coming through also and forming a square. And then another big shift happens with Mercury leaving Aquarius, coming into Pisces on February 6th, where Mercury will actually be all the way until April 14th because Mercury will be going retrograde at the end of the month in Pisces. So we have a really long transit of Mercury in Pisces that starts up there. It's an unusually important ingress of Mercury into Pisces. Then Venus comes into Pisces on February 10th. So we get this activation of Pisces. And the other thing about that opening of the month is that we have this stellium in Aquarius of Pluto and the Sun and Mars and Mercury and Venus all in Aquarius. And so that does start getting broken up. Then on February 13th, one of the normally it would be the biggest event of a month, but this month just has so much else happening on. We have Saturn coming into Aries. That's the final ingress of Saturn into Aries, Saturn not going back to Pisces. We then get the solar eclipse in Aquarius on February 17th, followed by that Saturn-Neptune conjunction on February 20th. And then less than a week later, Mercury stationing retrograde in Pisces, which again, normally that would be something we'd be focusing on a lot, and we will focus on that, but it doesn't seem that important. Like these other things are just so
Somehow.
so huge, especially that 1 week. That's quite extraordinary of that ingress of Saturn into Aries on February 13th, followed by this eclipse in the sign of Saturn, followed by the Saturn Neptune conjunction. And then just some of the aspects, like I mentioned, that those first like 8 days of February are highly Uranian, with that full moon activating Uranus, Uranus stationing, and then Mercury having a square to Uranus on February 5th, Venus having a square to Uranus on February 8th. Then, as we get into that middle part of the month where Saturn goes into Aries and we get the Saturn Neptune conjunction and the solar eclipse, we also have Mercury and Venus now moving through Pisces. And the most helpful aspect of this month to me is that Mercury and Pisces are moving through flowing, watery trine aspects with an exalted Jupiter retrograde in Cancer, which is really, to me, one of the best possible things that you can have for a Pisces transit, especially Mercury in Pisces being in its opposite sign, at least having this trine to an exalted Jupiter. Venus is exalted in Pisces, so there's an exalted Venus and trine to an exalted Jupiter. It's not the kind of thing that's going to take away all the difficulty, but I do think there's something incredibly creative here, especially in that intuitive, imaginative realm of Pisces as we are adjusting to whatever goes down with these big events. And then at the end of the month, we have Mars come through and activate Uranus again. At the same time, Venus is forming an exact conjunction with Mercury retrograde in Pisces. And that's going to be, the month ending in a really dramatic fashion with that Mars square Uranus. But yeah, when you're just looking at this and sort of like the big picture of the month with some of these ingresses and aspects, what are some things that come to mind for you, Aerin?
Yeah, like you said, it's any one of these things would usually be like something that we're kind of zeroing in on as like the big thing of the month. And then almost everything that's happening in February is a big thing of the month. So it's really high voltage. And I would agree with you that those lovely trines between Mercury and Venus with Jupiter add a kind of softening quality to something that yeah, really makes me think of like um, plugging like a huge amp into like an
Mm,
electrical socket that's not equipped to handle that kind of voltage. Like that's a bit of the energy of the month for me. But then the
hmm
water trines are in the background, so they're softer, but they're there. And I think that there's some support with that. But one of the biggest things that sticks out to me is Uranus.
mm,
Because it's sitting there stationing, like you said, for the last time, probably in any of our lifetimes in Taurus. And one by one, everything is kind of entering its relationality with
hmm
Uranus. Like we get Mercury and Venus at the beginning of the month coming into those squares just as they're exiting Aquarius.
hmm
And then that eclipse in the middle of the month will also be squaring Uranus. And
Yeah,
then we close out the month with Mars squaring Uranus. So it
yeah.
it kind of feels like it's egging everyone on a little bit to sort of come into its realm and I don't know, like gas up what is already a month full of intense transits.
Yeah, so what do you think about your Uranus can obviously be extremely rebellious. It can bring shocking events. It can bring shocking explosive events. I mean, certainly the thing at the end of the month with Mars square Uranus is a type of thing we do associate with collective, like explosive, violent, sudden, shocking, mundane events. In our personal lives, though, it's typically pretty different than that kind of thing happening. There's also that liberating quality that Uranus can often have, where even if something does take you by surprise or throw you off, it seems like it's throwing you off course or it's disrupting your plans. Although sometimes it's just the big, like, light bulb, sudden realization that sort of changes everything as you have this particular revelation. How do you feel like that element of Uranus coming in here being so active? Because, like you're saying, yeah, it's like the full moon is activating it. That solar eclipse is pretty much exactly also square it. The month ends with Mars. I mean, it's the entire month is an activation of Uranus. Even though, like, we're talking about Saturn, Neptune is the big story, Uranus is like not really giving much away. I know Uranus is really kind of claiming almost pretty similar power in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's giving steal the show.
Yeah.
I think I think it comes back to what we were saying about the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, that there's a tremendous amount of courage being asked of
Mm.
us in this time, both personally and collectively, because the constant repeated square to Uranus makes me feel that there's going to be a lot of unexpected circumstance and there's going to be a lot that's out of our control. And I find when people go through long Uranus transits, or something where you might get like three exact hits of it, often like people are going into it kind of bracing or maybe trying to just get through it or almost avoid it. Like I think it's very familiar for people to want to take an avoidant approach with Uranus because it can be so dysregulating. And it's like, okay, let me try to get through this as quietly as possible. And so the repeated squares make me feel like that's not the point of this time, to get through it as quietly as possible. Um, it's actually required of us to work with the energy of change or work with that catalyst energy to some extent, because if we don't, it's going to be like smacking us in the face anyways.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And like we're speaking of this, this is a chart for that full moon in Leo. It's about 13 degrees, 3 minutes of Leo, about 14 or so degrees away from the square with Uranus, but definitely moving towards a square with Uranus. And keeping in mind that Uranus is essentially stationing direct at the same time. It'll be officially stationed direct just 2 days later. Yeah, I think that is there's a thing with Uranus where I was recently doing a course with people looking at transits and for the year ahead, and we're also looking at our experiences of past Uranus transits and thinking about what could be coming up with that. And something some people were sharing in the class that I really liked was the concept of listening to Uranus and definitely coming into relation and not like you're saying dissociating. Sometimes with Uranus, we can get compelled to really leap ahead, and that can sometimes be too fast. I mean, there's a way our Uranus thing can come in and we start moving in a direction so quickly with the change. And so I think the more we can bring in a real consideration to what's going on. And one thing I like about this is as Uranus is stationing, this is already going on right now as you and I are talking, Saturn's been moving through this sextile with Uranus on the way out of Pisces. And I do think that that's been helpful. And there is something here about we need to engage with Uranus and work with the change that's wanting to come through. But there's also going to be something with Neptune already in Aries here, with Saturn about to go into Aries, not just rushing so fast ahead that it's beyond where we're really intending or what's going to be really the best outcome for us. Yet we do need to also, as much as you can, really following what is going to break you out into something much more authentic with your purpose and what's really bringing you alive and just making you really excited and activated with your particular type of brilliance and gifts and that sort of thing, with being able to freely express that as much as possible in whatever ways you can, as well as being open to like just experimentation in general, doing things different, any kind of innovative things. But like you're saying, sometimes, so yeah, things just happen where it can't just be it's out of your control with what's going on too, because of bigger things happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that piece about thoughtful process with Uranus because it has a kind of instantaneous push to it that may make us want to feel as if we have to leap into immediate action. Like I think the energy of it feels like we have to jump instantly. But I mean, if we think about Uranos as like the mythic being, it's the creation process. It's the
Hmm.
beginning of the whole pantheon of the gods. And so there is an instant impulse within that, like I want to create, or I want to do, or I want to bring something new into being. But there's also an incredible thoughtfulness in that of like what that may actually come to be and a lot of intention that I do think that's a beautiful piece to bring in the sextile from Saturn as well. That's really a part of this time because Saturn adds thoughtfulness to that impulse that comes so quickly.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's also, of course, the other element of this full moon in that just whatever you have in Aquarius, it's getting extremely activated in this whole period leading up to this full moon with Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, and Pluto all together in Aquarius. As you and I were talking this week, everything's moving through conjunctions with Pluto in Aquarius. And so that's also something to maybe kind of track, what's come up for you personally as this week of January 20th, 21st. I think Venus Pluto is maybe January 19th. Mars Pluto might be the January 27th. They're all this week basically moving through these conjunctions with Pluto. We've all been involved one way or another with some kind of Pluto in Aquarius story that we're just coming into a relationship with. And this is another initiatory aspect and journey like you were talking about. And there's likely something with Pluto being so activated by all this Aquarius that we've come into deeper contact with, and that might be working through some type of fear that you've had or some kind of resistance to some kind of deeper change that's been going on for you. Hopefully, you've been gathering the courage to really trust, with the faith to go forward into whatever night journey or initiation that's coming up for you to pass through at this time, because there is incredible creative potential which can come to the end of it. So whatever's been going on in this Aquarius part, essentially, with so much in Aquarius, just kind of on a simple level, I mean, it being so illuminated by this full moon, just setting it all off with this fiery Leo moon, it definitely feels like this sort of creative fire getting set off. And that also makes me think a lot about Uranus, in addition to Oranos, the association of Uranus with Prometheus, and Prometheus, bringing that creative fire to humanity, and real questions of like, what do you want to create with your life? And hopefully something here really getting pretty powerfully illuminated for you about this.
Yeah, I love that Prometheus piece because I feel like his actions were very much from the heart. And this full moon kind of gives the feeling to me of sometimes the heart knows what the mind cannot. With
Mm,
that huge pileup in Aquarius that you're describing there, like there's some deep process at work. Mercury, Venus, and Mars have not yet emerged from the beams of the sun where they all
mm.
made those. Well, I guess the Mercury Sun conjunction was actually in Aquarius, but Venus and
Yeah.
Mars had those big conjunctions a couple weeks ago
Hmm.
in January. And here they are all in Aquarius now. They haven't actually emerged yet, but as they're all piled up in Aquarius there's some kind of vast conceptual framework that's being built. We're
Hmm.
constructing a vision of our perspective on the world or what we believe reality to be. And then that full moon comes in and says, well, sometimes the heart knows something else altogether, even if it doesn't make sense. Like Prometheus's actions did not make sense. He was eternally punished for them. But it was inspired by a gesture of love, which really feels relevant to this moon.
Yeah, and Aquarius is just such a big theme, obviously, for the whole month. So this is a full moon that comes before the big solar eclipse in Aquarius later in the month on February 17th. I like what you're saying there about that. Yeah, there's something. So those Venus-Mars conjunctions, their cycles were seated in Capricorn, but they're clearly gestating, incubating something here in Aquarius. And for actually many people, depending on your locations, Venus could be coming out visible while she's still in Aquarius after this. Not at this point, most likely for anybody, but there is something taking shape there with Mercury, Venus, Mars with their new cycles, but it's in this very intellectual sign. I like what you were saying about the heart, because Leo, obviously, the full moon in Leo is going to connect us into that solar heart of things. Aquarius is an interesting sign, and I feel you have a good feel for it. Is there anything more you could say just collectively about Aquarius?
Yeah, in some ways, the opposition between the two signs feels to me like the heart doesn't matter so much to Aquarius, which doesn't mean that it's not a sign that doesn't have heart. Like I'm an Aquarius sun. I think, I'm a person who loves a lot and I feel a lot. So the stereotype of Aquarians being like cold or, unfeeling, I don't actually think is very true. I
Hmm.
think it's that the human feeling doesn't matter if it doesn't contribute anything to the conceptual framework. There's this feeling with Aquarius of like the whole puzzle at once. So the pieces are not important, and how you put the pieces together are not important, but there has to be some kind of larger context that they fit into. And then the challenges of the sign are when that context becomes very fixed. Like I've got it figured out, I've got it sorted, the pieces are in place, and nothing will interfere with that. And so
Mm.
that's where I think the squares to Uranus are so interesting because there's a real attachment with Aquarius. Like once an idea has been formed, um, it doesn't matter if it's betraying the heart. It doesn't matter if it's betraying the neighbor. Like, it doesn't matter if it's betraying the community. There's this fixity there, there's an attachment to it. And I
Hmm.
think that Uranus is kind of like this beautiful disturber of all of that Aquarian energy happening through the month, where yeah, we can have everything figured out in our minds, but is that actually going to work as a lived experience? And that's where the opposition comes in again. Like Leo is concerned with much more like our day-to-day lived experience. Like, how's that actually going to feel? What's that going to look like? What do we do? And so I like that this conceptual framework is kind of getting broken up a little bit because we have to actually ask if it can be implemented or if it's realistic.
Hmm. Good point. Also, I think about Pluto and Aquarius being a big part of this and really bringing, like you're saying, like that conceptual framework, that big idea, that ideals people are having, that Aquarians can get really fixated upon something having to be willing to die and be reborn with Pluto operating there. But maybe could you also say with that, I mean, so one hand would be, being willing to question the way you might be tying everything to a particular conceptual framework and potentially revisioning that framework. I definitely think that really connects to me with what's going to happen later in the month once Mercury goes retrograde in Pisces. I feel like that's going to be another element of this having to revision how we're even holding things together with our frameworks, and also perhaps checking in with like the alignment, because this could also be more positive. All are these different things that I'm working on, or different relationships, or different whatever it is there something where is this all going somewhere? Is it all really aligned with what it is that I'm actually wanting to conceive or bring together with my life and work?
Yeah, I love that. Like the heart also bringing something into alignment that fits with the bigger picture. And so maybe it's not necessarily like a disruption of the top that comes from the bottom, but actually the other way around. Like there's something from our lives and our desires and our connection with one another that's actually seeding information into the framework that we hold by how we're living our lives. And that, I think that's part of the beauty of like those three inner planets still being under the beams, like something is still emerging in our framework. It's still in process. And some of that may be in in like the very strong binary of Aquarius as well in what's right and what's wrong. And that we may be adjusting our sense of what's right and wrong, and also looking around us and seeing something that we perceive as wrong that's still happening anyways.
Hmm.
And I feel like the Leo moon is able to say, okay, well, I believe that's wrong. So what am I going to do on behalf of that?
Mm. That's a really good point. So, what's going to happen then is Mercury will be flying fast through Aquarius and will come in and activate Uranus with a square aspect on February 5th, and then move into Pisces on February 6th, which is going to be a big change of Mercury going from Aquarius to Pisces, this airy intellectual sign, into this very watery, creative, intuitive, inwardly, rich, fertile sign that's not as brilliant at articulating, these intellectual frameworks as Aquarius is, Mercury and Aquarius is. Mercury and Pisces has different types of gifts. So that's going to be significant. And then after Mercury hits that square with Uranus on February 5th, Venus does the same on February 8th. Of course, Uranus is in Taurus, the sign of Venus. This one feels really big, and especially to me with what you were describing there. Yeah, because Aquarians do get this reputation of being cold, and I was finding that insightful what you were saying about, is it when that happens when the person or whatever's going on doesn't fit into that conceptual framework, and the Aquarians really seeing that, and they're kind of taking it to that bigger level of that type of alignment, but that's not as personal feeling, although to the Aquarius it kind of is to have that bigger alignment. But something about Venus and Aquarius coming into that square with Uranus and Taurus there on February 8th, that feels pretty big to me with all these changes, and especially checking in with what's being born right now, because something is being born with Venus. She is coming through to, she's been invisible, she's been in the underworld, she is heading towards being visible again as an evening star. And as she's doing that, she's coming into the square with Uranus. So it really does feel like we have to align these things. And something also really wants to break free too, and be kind of liberated also, it feels like.
Mm. Yeah, I like that because it's actually making me think about that transit as a lead up to Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
And like the intimate discomfort of Venus square Uranus, like there's something unbearably vulnerable to Venus in Aquarius about having to really like relate from the heart or be vulnerable or be intimate with someone. Venus and Aquarius people, like it's a huge turn on to talk about the cosmos or like the meaning of reality. Like that's an intimate conversation. But and then you get really into like the muck of stuff for Venus and Aquarius. And it's like terrifying. So I think there's something around intimacy fear in there as well, that can be disruptive to that framework. Like, well,
Hmm.
how does my messy heart fit into like my framework that I'm trying to work with here?
Mm,
And how uncomfortable it can feel to get close to people or sort of like open your heart in that way.
totally. And it also makes me think about Venus and Aquarius. So having some pretty good skills in terms of social human networks and and connecting things, organizing things. So if there's community work that you want to be organizing, or these new creative directions emerging for you with this new Venus cycle, and organizing it, putting it all together. It feels too in a generative, positive way. I like the Venus Uranus for like the really breakthrough and like pushing you forward to like yeah, get going on this, like get it together, figure out how to organize this and bring these things together. Because then Venus very soon on February 10th goes into Pisces where she becomes exalted. The beginning of Pisces Venus is very powerful because she's exalted, she's in her own water triplicity. And that first part is like her own bound. So Venus in Pisces is very much in her element, you know, having not only having all the associations and connections of being in a water sign, but even being like exalted in this particular water sign. So it does feel like there is some real potential there for bringing people together, bringing ideas together. Mercury is also in Pisces at this point, and so I like it for the creative potential of it. As Saturn and Neptune at this point they're getting so close together, and we're right at the cusp of this big new birth of reality, really.
Yeah, an incredible artistry for both Mercury and Venus in Pisces. Like I have a lot of artist and musician friends that have Mercury in Pisces. I think from some traditional perspectives, it might get a bad rap for being in detriment and fall, but it's actually like one of my favorite Mercury placements because it's so incredibly poetic
Hmm.
and able to bring into articulation the things that logic cannot. So,
Hmm.
like you're saying, same with Venus. Like Venus will have so much strength in those early degrees of Pisces, and then being met by Mercury there, there's an incredible flood of creative
Hmm.
capacity that comes out of that. So interesting after we've had them go through this sort of like jarring passageway with Uranus. It's almost like waking up to something and then like you're coming out of a dream and there's this like incredible flood of inspiration that you leap forward into the day with.
Yeah, I really like that. And you're right, Mercury can be very poetic, really intuitive, really get big visionary ideas, really mix and blend and synthesize all sorts of combinations of things together. I think that's one of the reasons why, especially, you do see so many really talented writers and poets and artists and musicians that have Mercury and Pisces and do something really innovative with sort of seamlessly synthesizing and bringing all these things together. And I think it can be a really rich creative time for anybody working on art. I've been really excited when talking to people with astrology consultations, of people that have an artistic practice or there's something they're wanting to get inspired by or they're wanting to work on. And that to me is like really like the ideal for this time period because as disorienting as Saturn Neptune can be, it's so incredibly potentially powerful for artistic creation and giving birth to new ideas. And that element of things, Mercury in Pisces can be really good at in a very intuitive, imaginative way, especially in terms of, I think, with Mercury and Venus in Pisces, as we're going to have this the whole rest of the month, imagining something different. Because which is what we all really want to be doing right now, compared to what a lot of the stuff is happening, right?
Yeah, I love that. Like Mercury as our psychopomp guide, in this realm is actually very strong because, like you said, there's a lot of disorientation. And then adding that exact Saturn-Neptune conjunction into the mix, Mercury in Pisces knows how to steward us or to sort of guide us in those realms of disorientation, to actually lean into them in a way because I think we can all agree that like the
Hmm.
quote unquote regular reality we were living in was not actually working. And so we have to go into a disorientation to gather new ways of being. And I do think that Mercury in Pisces is a beautiful guide for that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I have to say, I call myself, I have Mercury in Pisces.
Mm.
So there's some good Mercury things I can do. There's other things where like Mercury being in its fall and its opposite sign, I can admit that I'm a little bit more disoriented in some of those mercurial types of tasks. But again, like when I think about Mercury in Pisces, that intuitive ability, I think is going to be one of the really key things, especially as we get towards the end of the month and we have this solar eclipse and we have Saturn and Neptune coming together at the same time. Mercury is slowing down to station retrograde on February 25th because I think Mercury retrograde in Pisces as we get to that towards the end of the month and we're dealing with the aftermath of the Saturn Neptune conjunction, really allowing yourself to follow this more intuitive sense of guidance through the storm, so to speak, is I think going to be important and something Mercury and Pisces can actually be pretty attuned to. It's not just it's not going to be the normal logical that type
Mm.
of rational linear mode of being or thinking. It's going to be open to the non-linear and the imaginal and the intuitive and so forth.
Yeah, I love that because I was thinking about with the full moon, there was this feeling of like the heart knows what the mind does not.
Mm,
But with that, it's a bit like the right brain knows what the left brain does not. Like,
mm,
I think that Mercury in detriment or Mercury retrograde, like these are very right-brained expressions of Mercury where you're going into the imaginal, you'll going into the dreaming, into the intuitive creative space. And that realm of our being will always know something that our logic brain can't reach on its own.
yeah, and sort of even more amping that up is the fact that once they're going into Pisces, and we have the North Node in Pisces, so February 11th, right after Venus goes into Pisces, Mercury goes across the North Node of the Moon. Venus will get to the North Node of the Moon on February 17th, like right when the eclipse is happening, but they're both essentially going to the North Node of the Moon, which I think can definitely amplify all those qualities that you were just talking about, as well as the fact that they also are moving into these trine aspects with Jupiter and Cancer. So those happen a little bit after the exact trines happen after the big event we're about to talk about of Saturn coming into Aries. But February 16th, Mercury comes into trine with Jupiter. February 22nd, Venus comes into a trine with Jupiter. So just like they both went to the square to Uranus, they're both moving to a trine with Jupiter. And really, with the exception of having Mercury in Pisces with Jupiter in Pisces, having Mercury in Pisces with Jupiter in Cancer, to me is one of the better combinations that we can have because at least the Lord of Mercury is in this case it's exalted. There's this really flowing watery trine, which is just really increasing this capacity to really have this intuitive, imaginative, creative um, perception opened up. And something
Yeah.
really kind of generative can come out of that, I think.
Yeah, it feels very much like the hope of the people in a way.
Mm-hmm.
That there's this incredible, like you're saying, generative flow and a deep sense of compassion that I
Mm-hmm.
think in some ways has been there with Jupiter and Cancer. But
Mm-hmm.
having Mercury and Venus in those trines is, I think, kind of in the background of all these really intense high voltage transits that are going on, there's a lot of hope and the human resilience of people to be able to pick themselves up after even the most horrific of events and have hope for
Mm-hmm.
something else and still somehow have energy to create something new is kind of what that feels like.
Yeah, absolutely. As well as Venus being exalted, Jupiter being exalted, and them coming into this trine with one another definitely also seems to speak to the same thing. And hopefully the children of Venus, all people we associate with Venus being lifted up somehow through whatever is going on. And I definitely really like that what you're saying about the going to the power of the people, because this is all still happening in the context of Aquarius and the fact that while this is all happening, we're going to have this solar eclipse in Aquarius.
Hmm.
So the big event of the month really is the entrance of Saturn into Aries, as well as the fact that the entire time of what we've been talking about, all the context of all the astrology we've already been discussing is the fact that Neptune comes into Aries at the end of January, not long before the beginning of February. But then on February 13th, we get this ingress of Saturn into Aries. And then a week later, on February 20th, we get the conjunction of Saturn with Neptune in Aries. And when you were just talking about hope, it really made me think of this quote by Manilius I really love about the sign of Aries, which he talks about how the ram who is rich with abundance of fleecy wool, and when shorn of this with a fresh supply, will ever cherish hopes. He will rise from the sudden shipwreck of his affairs to abundant wealth only to meet with a fall. He will yield his produce for the common benefit, the fleece which by 1,000 crafts gives birth to different forms of gain. Now workers pile into heaps the undressed wool, now card it, now draw it into a tenuous thread, now weave the threads to form webs, and now they buy and sell for gain garments of every kind. No nation could dispense with these, even without indulgence in luxury. So important is this work that Pallas Athena herself has claimed it for her own hands. I really love this quote because I feel it pulls out some other aspects of Aries that we don't always talk about. One of which being we often talk about Aries, charging ahead, and I love the sudden shipwreck to meet with a fall, but just to kind of get up again and just go forward again. That sort of renewal of Aries, being able to charge ahead, have something go wrong, have that kind of downfall, so to speak, but then get up again and push forward again with resiliency and new hope. But there's also something here speaking about, on one hand, we could think about renewable resources. To your point about resources, one of my big hopes with this time period is the fact that Aries is the exaltation of the sun. And with Neptune in Aries, Neptune essentially being in this place exalting the sun, as well as Saturn being there too. But I'm not sure if it'll happen, honestly, in the short term Saturn and Aries transit. But in this Neptune and Aries transit, which goes to 2038 and 2039, I am hopeful something about renewable resources. And, there's a lot of technology going on where they're trying to kind of recreate the energy of the sun, and something that could actually give us free energy and free energy sources that would potentially just completely change everything. It's actually something that goes with past patterns of Neptune and Aries. So I like this idea though of the ram's wool that, comes off and can be used and can go into building all these crafts and networks, but then always is renewing. Because Aries is actually a really brilliant sign. I mean, Aries people are actually far more intellectual and intelligent and brilliant and smart and creative and ingenious than they're often given credit for. It's one of those signs where it kind of gets pigeonholed, I feel like, into a certain perspective. Yeah, what do you think about that, or this quote?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. It's like magician energy, which
Yeah.
I think really speaks to this quote. It's so beautiful. Like Aries is about the raw material. And then I think it's not really always the concern of Aries what we end up doing with that raw material. It's just the harnessing of it or the initiation of it.
Hmm.
So I do think that about Aries people that they have this kind of brilliance to think of something anew or to create or to craft something. and it's not meant to be their domain, like what happens to that later down the road. But
Hmm.
I do love this quote specifically as a Saturn and Aries thing because I feel like it's showing us both the material and then the way that the material needs to be forged to make it
Mm.
usable. And that's a Saturn process.
Yeah.
Is like how not just the wool that comes off the sheep, but the many, many, many meticulous hand done processes through which that wool becomes like a beautiful garment that we wear.
Mm. Yeah, and also whether it's that or things created with the mind, I like this being turned into these threads that weave these different webs and connections, and how that spark of Aries can really, we think about Aries like starting something fast and then not sustaining it, or it just kind of, has that big fast burst, explosive burst, but that spark can really feed into all these networks and threads and weavings. And so it also makes me think a lot about being mindful of what you are weaving with your web, so to speak, and all the various networks, but something really powerful coming through here with this.
Yeah, and I think that the spark of Aries is often not lasting, but it doesn't matter because there's already eight new sparks beginning.
Yeah.
So
That's
it's
a good
not
point.
meant to
Yeah.
last.
Yeah.
It's like there's a constant surge of more coming behind it.
Mm.
So in that sense, it's highly renewable because
Yeah.
there's always more. It's just
There's
like the
always, yeah.
original thing is meant to burn out. So I think
Hmm.
that's something for us to consider because part of the discomfort for Saturn and Aries is that Saturn wants one thing to last a very long time.
Hmm.
And Aries is not lasting, but there will be many constant series of initiations that follow. So I think for Saturn and Aries, there is a feeling of taking a risk before we're ready. Like Saturn would prefer to have all of the information. It would prefer to know how to weave before it even shears the ram. But really, it's like you have to start with the shearing process and then learn how to create thread and learn how to dye it and learn how to weave and learn how to sew the garment. Like each step
Right.
of the way, you're learning the thing rather than having it all laid out before you take the risk of just beginning. And to me, that's part of why Saturn feels fallen in Aries, is that it's so uncomfortable to have to put the cart before the horse in that way.
Right. It's a sign that accentuates speed and moving forward, and Saturn is all about taking time and going slow and putting in all this disciplined, mundane work and attention. Yeah, slowly building these skills and processes and things like that. And so we do need to bring that together with this transit of Saturn in Aries. It also makes me think, while we're talking about this, it's referenced here, Pallas Athena's connection with Aries. And in the same Astronomica by Manilius, he also names Pallas Athena as being like a tutelary deity of Aries. And I really find this a fascinating connection that when I've been doing some talks and think classes about Neptune and Aries, I've been sharing a lot with people, is just to bring in Athena. I mean, a lot of times we think about Athena and Poseidon or Neptune being sort of pitted against each other, like with the city of Athens, for example. They were sort of competing to be who would be the patron deity, and he was bringing like the saltwater spring, and she was bringing the olive tree, something that's very useful for the civilization. That again, it sort of has a Saturn, that presence of Athena to bring in something that's really going to be lasting and in many different ways, and can lead to many different crafts and things that can come into the civilization um, in supportive ways. I think is really interesting with her, as well as that she's always the guardian of the heroic. And certainly with Neptune and Aries, including Saturn and Aries, we can expect this extra emphasis on the heroic and people that are acting like heroes or wanting to go off on a great adventure. And she does love her champions and guides them there, often with this very cunning wisdom. Like she's a daughter of Metis, and she has this really interesting ability to be cunning and deceptive herself as the way she sort of navigates Neptunian warpings of reality and with the different heroes she guides. And she's also always really good at when they're getting too carried away or wanting to do something really impulsive or aggressive that's going to be overly destructive to like hold them in check and to kind of flash at them with her eyes and make them pause. And so I think there's something really interesting about her. I feel like too to that we could bring in a little bit just thinking about Saturn Neptune coming together in Aries.
Yeah, I love that. I hadn't really thought of her in association with Aries. I've actually always kind of thought of her as an Aquarian figure. Maybe that's sort of like my bias
I
because
don't think you're
I'm an
alone.
Aquarius, but
I think it does make sense, and I think other
yeah.
people have that in their mind as well. Yeah.
But I like this perspective on it, and even the shape-shifting guardian of the heroic. That's beautiful
Yeah.
because we're talking about the becoming and rebecoming of Aries, and that there's always a new spark of being or something else
Mm-hmm.
that's ready to emerge. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I love also thinking about her in this time because she's so concerned with social repair. And you
Mm-hmm.
find her in a lot of the stories. Tending to repairing dynamics and orchestrating
Mm-hmm.
circumstances through which like something that was broken can be repaired or like some kind of relationship that
Mm-hmm.
has come apart to be
Mm-hmm.
facilitated and renewed again. So she's very oriented towards family and community and repairing connection. So I think that that's a really beautiful symbol for this time. I mean, if anything, I think at some point this month she'll be moving into Pisces, but she's been in Aquarius for about a year, which is
Yeah.
such an unusually long time for an asteroid. So we do also have, as part of this surge of all the planets starting to move from Aquarius into Pisces, Pallas Athena is also participating in that, which is kind of what she does. Like whatever the
Right.
people are doing down here on Earth, she comes down and gets involved in it. So I love that.
Yeah, when you were thinking about when you were talking about the conceptual framework of Aquarius, which I really like that as a thing with the big Pluto activation and the solar eclipse, we can definitely think about her connected to Aquarius in that same kind of way. Like she's definitely always holding that together and trying to like you're saying, orchestrate things to go into whatever that might be. So on February 13th is when Saturn then finally comes into Aries. So we did have this last year from the very end of May until the very beginning of September. Just like we also had Neptune and Aries from the end of March to about like October 22nd or so. So in both cases, with both Saturn and Neptune, we did have some movement in the new Aries directions getting initiated and launched last year, but there was then that shift back to Pisces. So it could be that some of those things you started last year from, end of May to beginning of September, if you had new ideas that didn't haven't totally come together yet, perhaps there is another big activation of that here. Certainly for Saturn and Aries, people having their Saturn return, that's absolutely going to happen with this ingress. Have you noticed anything like that though, in terms of like with yourself or the people like what was kind of activated with Saturn and Aries last year, where it seems like as we're heading to this, it might be coming up again for another layer of that story or next installment, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen it in my own life, and then some people that I'm close with that there were things that started to sprout in the summer that suddenly it was like being back in old territory come fall. I felt that ingress from Aries back into Pisces so intensely, but there was like a kind of a big circumstance around it for me,
Mm-hmm.
but it felt like such a distinct shift of being back in old territory. And some of that's also been really beautiful. Like, I think that there were processes starting with Saturn and Neptune at the tail end of Pisces. Particularly, what I noticed for myself was some of the themes in the spring when we had that double Mercury Venus retrograde last spring that was moving from Aries back into Pisces. We had the eclipse in Pisces with Saturn and Neptune there. And I feel like just now, this fall, there are things that are starting to culminate and come to fruition that would have seemed like they were moving in a particular direction at that time, but weren't yet meant to be. Like there's this real feeling of incredible timing behind it. That now I feel like having this last chapter for Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, for me, there are things that have come to be now that I thought were going to be sooner. And then it seemed like, oh, suddenly I'm going in a completely different direction. Oh, now I'm back here and it's actually coming to fruition. So, like, following the process of it has been really incredible. And
Yeah.
some things still unknown. Like there are things that I'm hoping to put to bed as Saturn and Neptune move on that I don't yet know what will be.
Hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And there was also a big grand water trine activated for months there with Saturn and Neptune back in Pisces with Jupiter and Cancer and all this stuff moving through Scorpio that I think was really part of what you're talking about.
Mhm.
But it does feel like, yeah, things have been dissolving. Things are really getting set up for this big burst of renewal. And, this Aries point is just so incredibly powerful of being the intersection of the celestial equator, projected out with the ecliptic. It's like literally like the node of the sun. It's a really like tangible, kind of concrete point of like extreme manifestation for them to come together here. It's just so powerful. Previous Saturn and Aries periods, which, they're not going to be quite the same because they weren't Saturn, Neptune, and Aries periods, but we had the end of the 90s, like 1996 to 1999, which though was, there's all sorts of changes coming in, especially with the internet at that time, but definitely think about global power dynamics as well, really shifting. The late 60s, 1967 to 1969, another really dynamic time of like fraying and new things coming in and new orders and upheaval. Late 30s, 1937 to 1940, which led up to World War II, and that had a lot of rise of fascism, Nazism, Spanish Civil War, and so forth. We don't need to go through all the past history of Saturn in Aries, but one thing a previous time was like 1849 to 1852, and one thing that I was thinking was kind of interesting about that was in the United States, that was a time period where people were afraid that we were going to go into a civil war. And that was put off with something called the Great Compromise. With that, they also brought in this Fugitive Slave Act. But what also was born then was like, Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. So there is something about Saturn and Aries, which I think is really interesting when we're thinking about what are the people going to be able to organize and create like networks to, if they're, because we are seeing on one hand some rise of authoritarianism again, but there's also something really potent here about the ability to organize something for yourself and create your own new order and system and networks to kind of get through whatever needs to happen, in the face of that.
Yeah, and I love the Underground Railroad as kind of like a symbol for Saturn and Aries in a way and what's possible because it was a huge network that was formed through the courage of individuals, which is really
Hmm.
what Aries is about. And I think that is where it can be so scary, like all of those chapters that you mentioned have some kind of fear of the unknown, even like the late 90s being like the Y2K fear. Like I
Oh,
remember
right.
that very well.
Yeah.
It was
Uh-huh.
like, is the world going to end when the clock
Right.
hits the year 2000? But obviously, more intense forms of that during these periods of intense social revolution. And so I think it's scary because we can't like see past our own nose where Aries is concerned, but the courage of individuals adds up to a greater sum of its parts in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's likely to be something, as we're kind of going through the month, something kind of gets picked up here even more extreme. And then, when that happens with the moons in Capricorn, where the moon's waning here in Capricorn when Saturn comes into Aries, it's opposite Jupiter. And then just a few days later, we actually get the moon coming in to eclipse the sun at 28, 29 degrees of Aquarius, very closely in square to Uranus in Taurus. With Mars starting to, I mean, Mars is what, like still 8 degrees away from a square to Uranus. It's going to come in at the end of the month. But yeah, especially this eclipse square Uranus, like we were talking earlier, this is another point where Uranus just comes back in really strong. This is the first Aquarius solar eclipse. The North Node's still in Pisces, and Venus is there with the North Node, but it's close enough to be an eclipse. There will be another Aquarius solar eclipse in February of 2027, and then even a third one in January of 2028. So this is setting up a thing where we're going to have one this year, one next year, and one in 2028. So there's going to be a series of Aquarius solar eclipses happening in that part of your chart. So this is a bigger story opening up here. And one of the things that's also interesting to me is astrologers often talk about, right, you have a new moon in a sign, and then later in the year, you might get a full moon in that sign, and there's a story that goes. Well, the full moon in Aquarius that happens later in the year at the end of July is completely lighting up this really powerful configuration of Uranus and Gemini, Neptune and Aries, Pluto and Aquarius, Jupiter and Leo with the sun all forming this powerful configuration. It's kind of one of the hot moments of the whole year. And so there is something, what gets launched at this solar eclipse, and then between this and the full moon in Aquarius that comes at the end of July, just has, I mean, it's an incredible force of astrology. It's the thing, it kind of brings together all the things people have been talking about, 2026 being like this launch of a new era type of quality. This is a really powerful eclipse in all those ways, like something really getting initiated here with big new storylines that are going to come into shape for, many years, really.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful in that way. And like you said, there's that link to there's this very powerful astrology that we're talking about in February. And then again, July, I would say, is like probably one of the most powerful months of the year as well.
Yeah,
And there are
totally.
several astrological links between the 2 months. So it really does feel like there are tectonic plates shifting here with this eclipse. And we may not see where the mountains are for another period of time. I find sometimes with eclipses, the events happen right on them, but I find that a lot of the time it's between the eclipses or kind of as the season
Hmm.
unfolds that we start to see what's really taking shape. So it does feel like there's some kind of like disturbance in the belief field here, you know.
Hmm.
We were talking about with Aquarius, who believes what and like which side are you on and like what camp do you hold to? And this is the issue of the Aquarian age is that everyone can feel that they're right and have completely different perspectives on reality. So I do feel like there is some kind of tectonic plate shifting here,
Hmm.
because we can't function as a collective with such highly rigid, divisive beliefs happening.
Mm. Yeah. Also, like you're saying, they often are general signs of larger storylines changing. For all of us, sometimes when a particular eclipse hits and we are having some really dramatic moment of something happening with our story. But oftentimes, eclipse happens and it doesn't seem like anything really particularly all that especially eventful actually happened in your life on that particular day, out of the ordinary, really, or anything. And it is also true that oftentimes these are even more dramatic for people that are like heads of state or leaders or celebrities or CEOs or people in charge of something are often the people that are being eclipsed. It is interesting with it starting up this Aquarius Leo series. There'll be a Leo solar eclipse on August 12th. It does make me wonder about the power to the people, people more on the margins, networks, things like that getting more prominence. But with it being in a sign of Saturn and Saturn and Neptune coming together at the same time, that's the part where it just looks really particularly quite powerful for what's going to come in here.
Yeah, and I do think that's a good point to bring in like that sense of collective power here, which is to me why Aquarius is the detriment of the sun,
Hmm.
because the sun, the solar energy is the only thing that we see in the sky. When the sun is up, we don't see the planets, we don't see the stars, we just see the sun. So it's an individual expression. It's meant to kind of um, garner all visibility towards itself, whereas Aquarius is about equal multiplicity, like that we thrive in the multiplicity and that each thing has its place, but is not really meant to be foregrounding any one thing above the other. So the sun doesn't necessarily thrive in that sign for that reason. But for us as a collective or as human beings, it's beautiful because within Aquarius, there's space for everyone to exist.
Yeah, I really like that. And so again, this just looks like, and just for, being aware of if you're tracking current events, while your own personal life may or may not be especially dramatic on this particular day, we can expect like world events and big storylines to be pretty off the charts dramatic, which of course, depending on where you're living, you could be someplace where that's impacting you in one way or another. And that's, so we get the solar eclipse on February 17th, followed by the exact Saturn Neptune conjunction on February 20th. We've already been talking about this, but it's not like, again, it's like just on this day or on the days around it that it's going to be the whole story for you. Likely, this is like a big signal of a threshold that's really marking this time of great change in your story. And when you look up past famous examples in history of Saturn Neptune times, I mean, sometimes there's things happening like right around the day of the conjunction, but there's so many countless examples where they're even typically not on the exact day. So it's not like everything's going to happen on this day, but it's definitely marking this huge inception point. And combined with the way things get distorted and really accelerate with change with eclipses normally, because we're also in the middle of eclipses here now. There'll be a lunar eclipse in Virgo on March 3rd. So we're in between eclipses where things tend to really get weird and strange and things are shifting and changing. And even the moon being in Aries around this time, it looks very fast, big changes happening basically.
Yeah, but I think that's a really good point that, especially with slower moving planet conjunctions, it
Hmm.
can be years and years before we actually see the quote unquote event of it. So there's
Hmm.
been tons of like astrological speculation about what this will be, but both Saturn and Neptune haven't even really spent time in the sign of Aries yet, as far as this cycle is concerned. So it may be some kind of sudden process or sudden shift because they've both recently made that ingress back into the sign. But if we're thinking about them in terms of their synodic cycle, like that's almost 40 years long. And so, from that zoomed out perspective, depending on how old someone is, they might think about this as a new 36, 7 year chapter in their life, where the last one began in the late 80s. Or we might think about some of the actual events of the Saturn Neptune conjunction starting to sprout in our lives when they come into that first opening sextile in a few years. So I
Hmm.
think, yeah, we may not know exactly what it will be, but I agree that because of the nature of everything else happening and being in the midst of eclipse season, there may at the same time be some immediate events that come out of it. It is 0 degrees of Aries after all.
Yeah. And I think, again, some of the more positive aspects of this combination can be that manifestation of your dreams, having these idealistic, inspirational ways you want to change your life and bring things into form. And so again, it's not like that's all going to happen on like one day. These are like processes that take time. But if the more, especially as we're coming into this time, we're getting more and more clear about this and just doing whatever step you can, letting that path open in front of you and following that path and, doing all the work you need to do with whatever it is. I think that's really like the intention to bring into this, and that it's something new. It's something that's going to bring new movement, new creativity, like new aliveness, that infectious, fiery quality and spirit of Aries, right? To like really light something up and then it's going to be a whatever it is that you're willing to create here. It's going to take time, but we're entering a period with all the way everything's coming together where there could be some big jump starts this year and big activations to really get things moving in pretty powerful ways. So that's what I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about just this idea of daydreaming
Mm,
and like letting our imagination wonder about a different kind of reality, or to take out of the equation like all of the challenges that are in front of us right now and just say, if you could have any kind of world or if you could have any kind of life for yourself, what would that be? Without having to immediately put in front of us the actual lived experience that we have. So that might be the Neptune piece, is just like the
hmm
pure imagination that is not necessarily connected to what's actually happening. But then Saturn is willing to make that corporeal. So I
hmm
think the daydreaming aspect of it is really important because we can't build new worlds without imagining something that is completely different from what's already here.
Totally. And that's also really that on one hand, we got Venus, that exalted Venus in Pisces coming into an exact trine with Jupiter here. And then within a week, so what's also happening here is in the Mercury cycle, is as we come into that conjunction, Mercury is in Pisces and moving away from that exact trine with Jupiter. But Mercury is starting to really slow down because basically at the same time on February 19th, Mercury's hitting max elongation. So Mercury's getting up to its greatest height. It's going to start slowing down, getting closer and closer to the western horizon at sunset. It's then going to station retrograde and then go into the underworld. And as we were talking earlier, I really think as we come into a week later, February 26th, when Mercury stations retrograde, 22 and a half degrees of Pisces, with Venus coming into a conjunction with Mercury at the same time, I what you were just saying is the summary of what I feel like this could be
Mhm.
helpful. So I'm really glad you're just saying all that. I again like really opening to imagining something different. Whatever it is you're getting these ideas about, now we got to go into the imaginal of how do we make it happen? What needs to change? There may not be the forward progress of being able to shoot off really fast completely here. Mercury retrograde may be making you realize something you got to work on. There might also, if there's so deep research as part of that, Mercury retrograde periods are amazing for deep penetrative research. I think creative experimentation, like say you're like working on music or art or all the work you're putting into it before like the final form ends up coming out could be really powerful here for any kind of artistic creative process you're engaged in that takes you through this retrograde. So it just may not be like, if you're expecting things are just going to be all like everything's going normal order and linear logical types of mind frames and processes, that's not probably what's happening here. But of course, when Mercury stations, we just really, especially here, I think with the Saturn Neptune, like bringing extra mindfulness to your daily life. And especially with Pisces and that trine to Jupiter, really note the dreams, the omens, the signs, like what's showing up to help to help guide you with where you need to go here.
Mhm.
And yeah, anything else that you think about with this one stationing?
No, I think you said it beautifully. It's like a way of living in deep relationality.
Mm,
And I think that I'm saying this ahead of time because I think it may be tempting for these things to be quiet or sort of missed in the background of the loudness of some of the other
Hmm.
transits.
Yeah.
And something that I've been thinking a lot about in my own life is like the importance of letting yourself feel joy and inspiration and
Mm.
connection in the midst of very intense circumstances. So I do feel like these softer water trines are really supporting that. And certainly, Mercury retrograde in Pisces is a very quiet process, it's very internal. But it's extremely powerful at the same time.
Yeah, and the way it starts off with contact to Venus and then going back to trine Jupiter, I really like that focus on quiet, on what's going to bring you pleasure and joy, and really trying to get into that space when you can, which might be having to remove yourself at times from all the loudness and busyness. It is a Mercury retrograde process that on the other side of it, before Mercury stations direct, there will be, we begin with Mercury and Venus and Jupiter together. It will end with Mercury and Mars coming together. So there's going to be a little bit more of that Mars strife and action and disruption coming in on the other side of it. But that's not this part of it in February. So I really like the connection with joy you were bringing up. Now, and that's going to be really key because at the same time this is happening, Mars is coming into square Uranus as well as Venus combined with Mercury. So that's our final aspect to talk about here. This can be a big explosive combination when Mars and Uranus come together. With Mercury stationing, I would definitely say really be mindful. If you're driving, don't go into driver's rage or get on social media and just say a bunch of stuff you're going to regret or like get in needless arguments and, things could really go directions you may not want. I mean, it's a potential really volatile combination. But yeah, how do you feel about this Mars Uranus coming in here at the end?
Yeah, it definitely requires a deep breath before reacting. Like it's a very reactive transit, because I think neither Mars nor Uranus tend to think before doing. Like they're very responsive planets.
Yeah.
So together, that's why they have that explosive quality is like no one's pausing to kind of slow down and think about it first. So yeah, I do think there's an intensity to them that will probably feel very heightened. But one way that I've been thinking about it is as an indication of some of the astrology of July, because we were mentioning some of the
Hmm.
astrological links there.
I think I have
So
yeah, there's that conjunction in July.
exactly. Yeah, they'll make that conjunction and it will be squaring the nodes at the node's last degree in Pisces and Virgo. So it looks like a very big transit. And I
Because there
think
could
that
essentially be whatever, we don't know what's going to happen when Mars and Uranus come together, but potentially something dramatic here, storylines could end up connecting back down there, right? Yeah.
exactly, because this
Yeah.
is the last hard aspect we're going to get between them before they make that conjunction. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, one way to think about transits is as part of the larger cycle. We were talking about that with Saturn and Neptune. So here there's some kind of tension point or closure in the synodic cycle of Mars and Uranus that is being worked out or trying to resolve itself because something else is going to reinitiate in July. So I do think it's a bit of a foreshadow. Like whatever events take place with this Mars Uranus square may indicate some of the themes that are going to come up in the summer.
Yeah, and that would further go with what we were saying about the Aquarius solar eclipse, and then there's a full moon in Aquarius at the end of July as well as another element. And I guess another thing would be just, again, being open to innovation and breakthroughs and really having the courage to pursue like a bold direction here with considered action, like we were talking about. And then the only other thing going on, it's basically at the same time, is Mercury and Venus coming together. So that happens basically the same day, or depending on your time zone, it could be February 28th, but it's around the same time as that Mars Uranus square. So we do get this Venus Mercury retrograde connection here, which we've already been talking about. Is there anything else you'd like to add in about this? Perhaps it's good that it comes after the Mars Uranus, so there could be some repair or mediation of whatever comes up with the Mars Uranus.
Yeah, I think repair is a nice word for this transit. And another way to think about it is that Mercury and Venus are often considered personal planets, whereas something like Uranus is more collective. And so this may be something that's happening more in our personal lives, whereas the Mars Uranus square might be something that we see happening more socially or collectively. But I think it
Mm.
brings back what we were saying earlier about the importance of allowing joy and connection and
Hmm.
creativity and spaciousness, not just regardless of what's happening, but actually, most importantly, because of it. It
Mm.
is especially in times of great intensity that we need that kind of pleasure and connection more than anything. It's so important.
I totally agree with you. And when I was spending time previously researching Saturn and Neptune cycles and just what normally happens, I mean, that was basically the conclusion I came to myself, which really I think the most important thing that we can really do is intentionally create spaces of joy and pleasure and in community. And we're going to really want to keep that in mind this month. And I do like that, like you were just saying, that Mercury retrograde coming at the end with Venus and just Mercury and Venus spending all that time together in February where all this is going on that could hopefully be a way, an outlet people have to help create those experiences for themselves. And that could be it just in small ways, whatever small things you can do in quiet moments during the day to give yourself a sense of joy, even if it's just for a certain amount of time with whatever's going on. It's going to be really important.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of what we talked about is how these transits kind of speak to something being the sum of its parts, and large scale change being a series of individual moments of courage that kind of add up to a larger whole. And so I feel like that Mercury Venus piece speaks to it as well. You know, we might be like doom scrolling on social media or like seeing really intense things showing up in the news. But what are we doing in the hours of our day? You know, can we still have dinner with a loved one? Can we still play? Can we still pick up our guitar? You know, like what can we actually fill the minutes of our day with in a way that's like feeding the larger vision and that kind of
Mm.
Neptune piece of this time?
Yeah, and also in ways, Saturn and Neptune are both about time and even like timelessness and big time. A lot of times the big current event stories and what seems important to us because of how the media and what's going on in the world has been portrayed, like later on it's not going to really be such a big deal in some cases, but things that end up becoming really big deals, like somebody that ends up creating some masterpiece or um, musical album that changes everybody's life in so many ways, or many people's, it gives um, numerous sources of inspiration that lives on well past their death, like immortal classics of art and creation. It can be just that small moment of during one of these days that somebody just has this idea, or they're writing something in their journal, or they're it's just like those really small moments can lead into that big creativity and creative act that we won't even know it happened unless we happen to be friends with one of these people that does one of these great works. But it's a time period where likely there will be things like that coming out of this time period, you would think. And so cultivating the space to let that happen for yourself, I think is going to be important.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, the last time Saturn was in Aries, there was a ton of like really good punk music being made. I feel like that's kind of a good, um, like if there were a genre for Aries, it would be punk.
Hmm.
And punk is music that came out of like a whole bunch of different bands. These are people that are just at home writing their own music, but it's a social movement at the same time. Like it's
Hmm.
music that's in response to something that's happening. at a larger scale. So I think that's a great point is like we don't necessarily see the fruition of that for a few years, but in the midst of intense process, people are at home working on things or
Hmm.
collaborating or visioning, and it takes time for that to come out in the world.
Totally. That's awesome. Well, thank you for going through all this astrology with me. It's a really dramatic month to do, but yeah, thank you. Is there anything you have coming up that you'd like to let people know about in particular?
I just announced a light weaving training, so it's not astrology related, but it's an extremely helpful tool that I use in my day-to-day life. Light weaving is basically like a direct form of prayer. You're amplifying, it's very Neptunian, you're amplifying energy around a prayer. And so every year or so, I do little trainings to teach people how to use this technique in their day-to-day life. So I have one coming up, I think February 27th. It's
Oh,
somewhere
great.
around that that Mercury Venus conjunction that we were just talking about.
That sounds
Um,
perfect. Yeah.
yeah, it's a great, it'll be a great thing to do with that transit. And so I have a couple spots still open for that. And then I have a few things coming up that I haven't announced yet. So people are welcome to sign up for my mailing list or follow me on social media if they want.
Okay, awesome. And are you also doing astrology consultations and things like that too
Oh,
right
yes.
now?
Yeah.
You're doing that too.
Thanks.
Cool.
So that's my day to day. So I always have my books open for
Hmm.
consultation. And I love working with new people. So definitely accepting new people on the books if anyone wants to come and chat about the month.
Cool. Yeah, I know. Yeah, Aaron's definitely very part of your gift is that light weaving realm of modalities. So if that's of interest to you, I definitely recommend checking that out.
Mhm.
As for me, the main thing is really going to be that my books are also open for astrology consultations. I'm not thinking of any actual courses where there's space available or anything like that coming up in February, besides just if you want to work with me one on one. So I'll also have a link to that below. Well, yeah, thank you again, Aerin, for being here, and I wish the best for all of us as we move into this powerful time of change.
Thanks for having me.